Now, the model, TV presenter and special police officer Penny Lancaster has opened up about dyslexia, IVF and her marriage to Sir Rod Stewart in her new autobiography, Someone Like Me.
Rod Stewart has been married 3 times, fathered 8 children with 5 different women, and spent 50 years building a reputation as one of rock's great romantic conquerors. And yet, when an 80-year-old Rod Stewart sat down for one of the most candid interviews of his career, he didn't talk about conquest. He talked about the one woman he says he never should have let go, the one whose name still catches in his throat decades later, the one he described in 3 words that say more than any love song he ever wrote: "It tore me to shreds." Here's the strange part. The woman fans assume he means isn't always the one people expect, and the real story behind why she left is far more uncomfortable for Rod than the simple explanation is given in public for years. Before the leopard print suits, before the spiked blonde hair, before the raspy voice that would define a generation of rock radio, Rod Stewart was a working-class kid from Highgate in North London. He was born on the 10th of January, 1945, the youngest of 5 children to a father who ran a newsagent shop and a mother who kept the household together. There was nothing glamorous about where he came from, and very little in his early life suggested he would become one of the best-selling music artists in history, with reported sales exceeding 250 million records worldwide. At 17, Rod fell into a relationship with a young art student named Susanna Boffey. They were teenagers in the truest sense, meeting at nightclubs, marching together at anti-nuclear demonstrations, falling into the kind of intense first love that only happens before anyone has any real responsibilities. Then Susanna became pregnant. Rod was 17, broke, and entirely unprepared for fatherhood. According to multiple biographical accounts, he initially wanted the baby placed for adoption immediately. Susanna tried to raise the child alone for several months before the daughter, named Sarah, entered the foster care system, moving between different homes before eventually being adopted by another family. Sarah didn't learn the identity of her biological father until she turned 18, and contact between her and Rod remained sporadic for decades afterward. It was only much later in life, after Sarah's adoptive mother passed away, that the two began to rebuild a relationship, with Rod publicly expressing regret over how those early years were handled and acknowledging that the bond between them could never replicate what a father who raised his daughter from birth would have. By the time Rod Stewart became a global star in the 1970s, he had fully embraced the rock star persona that would define his public image for the rest of his career. In 1975, he began a relationship with Swedish actress Britt Ekland, who had recently appeared as Mary Goodnight in the James Bond film The Man with the Golden Gun opposite Roger Moore. Ekland was one of the most photographed women in the world at the time, and their relationship became deeply intertwined with Rod's music. She provided the whispered vocal outro on his #1 hit Tonight's the Night, and Rod wrote You're in My Heart during their time together, an era many consider the peak of his creative output. The relationship ended in 1977 after roughly 2.5 years, and according to Ekland's own account, she learned about Rod's infidelity in a particularly humiliating way. Her ex-boyfriend, actor George Hamilton, called to inform her that his own wife had just left him for Rod, inadvertently revealing that Rod had been unfaithful to Ekland as well. Ekland didn't let the breakup go quietly. She filed a $12.5 million lawsuit against Stewart in California, arguing that she had sacrificed her own career to support his. The case was eventually settled out of court for a reported $500,000 in property. In later interviews, Ekland has said publicly that Rod never apologized to her, not once, and that she believed an apology would have helped her find closure. Decades afterward, when Rod appeared on the British talk show Loose Women, he acknowledged that Ekland remained the one former partner who still refused to speak with him, framing it as something she needed to get over rather than reflecting on the lack of an apology she had specifically asked for. After Ekland came a long, complicated stretch involving multiple overlapping relationships. Rod began dating model Kelly Emberg while still married to his first wife, Alana Hamilton, and the relationship with Emberg lasted roughly 7 years, producing a daughter, Ruby. Emberg has said in interviews that being in love with someone you know is wrong for you is one of the hardest things a person can experience, and she was eventually left to raise their daughter largely on her own after Rod moved on to his next major relationship. His marriage to Alana Hamilton, meanwhile, is notable for how it differed from nearly everything else in Rod's romantic history. Alana was previously married to actor George Hamilton, the same man who would later inform Britt Ekland that her relationship with Rod was over. Rod and Alana married in 1979, had 2 children together, Kimberly and Sean, and divorced in 1984 after 5 years. Unlike his other major relationships, this one ended without the bitterness that characterized so much of Rod's romantic history. Alana and Rod remained genuinely friendly afterward, to the point where she reportedly hosted a Christmas dinner that included both Rachel Hunter and Kelly Embug, 3 of Rod's most significant partners gathered under one roof. Then, in 1990, everything changed. Rod walked into the Roxbury nightclub in Los Angeles. He was 45 years old, recently divorced, and according to his own autobiography, was in the process of planning a proposal to Kelly Embug, having reportedly arranged for a small plane to Trail Labana with the question written across the sky. That same night, before any of that happened, he met a 21-year-old New Zealand supermodel named Rachel Hunter, who had appeared in Vogue, Sports Illustrated, and Elle. In his autobiography, Rod wrote that there was an immediate connection, describing Hunter as extremely beautiful but also possessing a no-nonsense quality that set her apart from the women he typically encountered, someone whose financial independence was, in his words, a relief, because it removed the constant suspicion of whether your partner liked him or simply liked what came with him. 3 weeks after meeting her, Rod proposed. 3 months later, on December 15, 1990, they married at Beverly Hills Presbyterian Church. His sister, Mary, watching the ceremony, reportedly told him as they walked that Rachel was too young for him, a warning Rod has since admitted he should have listened to. They had 2 children together, daughter Renee, born in 1992, and son Liam, born in 1994. By Rod's own account, he remained completely faithful throughout the marriage, describing himself as having become a devoted husband almost overnight, something that stood in sharp contrast to his earlier relationships. But in January of 1999, after 8 years together, Rachel left. The divorce wasn't finalized until years later, but the separation marked the end of what many consider the defining relationship of Rod's life. What makes this breakup different from all the others is the explanation Rachel herself gave. In a 2001 interview with a British newspaper, Hunter described what those years had actually felt like, saying that to the outside world she appeared to be a happy mother and successful model without financial worries, but that internally she was in torment. She said that by the time she was 29, she had spent 8 years immersed in someone else's circle of friends and had never done anything purely for herself. She admitted that if someone had asked her what she liked or didn't like during that period, she wouldn't have been able to answer, and that she didn't even have a hobby of her own. She described feeling, in her own words, like she no longer had an identity at all. Rod's version of events has remained simpler and more focused on his own pain. He has said in multiple interviews, including a notably candid one published in the Times newspaper when he was 80 years old, that Rachel left because she was too young, and that his sister had been right to warn him from the very beginning. He has described the aftermath using the same word repeatedly, shreds. He said it tore him to shreds, that he genuinely believed Rachel was the one, and that losing her was the most devastating thing that ever happened to him romantically. According to some accounts, he spent months afterward in a state of genuine despair before eventually meeting his current wife, Penny Lancaster, roughly 6 months later. What stands out, when you look closely at how Rod talks about this loss compared to how Rachel has described it, is the gap between the two perspectives. Rod frames the end of the marriage as something that happened to him, an outcome determined by an age gap he should have recognized as a problem from the start. Rachel's own words paint a different picture, one of a young woman who entered a marriage with an established, famous, much older man and gradually lost her sense of self inside his world, his friends, his schedule, his career, and his existing family. There was no infidelity scandal this time, no tabloid headline about another woman, no lawsuit. Instead, there was simply a 29-year-old who realized she had disappeared inside someone else's life and needed to find her way back to her own. Rod met Penny Lancaster roughly 6 months after Rachel left, at a point when he was 53 years old, twice divorced, and had already fathered 6 children with 4 different women. Penny was a 27-year-old model who had been photographing him on tour, and according to interviews she's given, she wasn't even particularly familiar with his music when they met, nor was she looking for a relationship at the time. She has described being drawn into his world almost before she had time to think it through. But something about this relationship unfolded differently than the ones before it. Rod and Penny married in 2007 in Italy, and that marriage has now lasted longer than any of his previous unions by a significant margin. They share 2 sons, Alistair and Aidan, bringing his total number of children to 8. In interviews given later in life, Rod has spoken about Penny with a tone noticeably different from how he discussed his earlier relationships, describing her as having mended his heart in ways he hadn't expected, and saying he wished they had started having children together sooner, so they could have had more. It's a strikingly different sentiment from the man who, in earlier decades, would sometimes speak about his firstborn daughter with detachment, suggesting in old interviews that people could count her among his children if they chose to. The contrast suggests a degree of genuine growth, even if Rod's public reflections on his past relationships still tend to center his own emotional experience rather than fully reckoning with what his partners went through. Looking at the full picture of Rod Stewart's romantic history, a pattern becomes hard to ignore. Susanna Boffey was left to manage the consequences of an unplanned pregnancy largely alone, while their daughter grew up without knowing her father's identity for nearly 2 decades. Britt Eklund says she never received the apology she felt she deserved after a public and humiliating breakup. Kelly Emberg was left raising a daughter after years in a relationship that began while Rod was still married to someone else. Alana Hamilton's marriage ended the most amicably of them all, perhaps because, as someone with more life experience by that point, she understood the terms of the relationship more clearly than the others did. And Rachel Hunter, the youngest and most independent of all of Rod's major partners when they met, ended up losing her sense of self so completely inside his world that she described herself, in her own words, as having become nothing. None of this necessarily makes Rod Stewart a villain. What it suggests, based on his own statements over the decades and the accounts given by the women involved, is a pattern of a man who was present in the sense of providing fame, financial security, and a kind of magnetic charisma, but who struggled to be present as an equal partner who recognized what was happening to the person standing next to him. He was a headline act in every sense of the term, on stage and at home, and the women in his life were often required to orbit around that reality rather than share it with him. When people ask which woman Rod Stewart should never have let go, the obvious answer, based on his own words, is Rachel Hunter. Here's the one who used the phrase "tore me to shreds." Here's the one who has called her the one he truly believed was forever. But a closer look at the story suggests the more accurate answer is slightly different. It isn't simply Rachel Hunter as she exists today, an internationally established model, television personality, and businesswoman who has long since rebuilt her own identity and independence. It's the 21-year-old version of her who walked into a Los Angeles nightclub in 1990 with her own career, her own money, and her own future entirely intact before she married into a world built around someone else's fame. Rod has acknowledged that her age and his at the time of the marriage played a major role in what eventually went wrong, but what often goes unspoken is how completely she had to absorb herself into his existing life in order for that marriage to function at all, something that left very little room for the woman she had been before she met him. Now in his 80s, Rod Stewart appears to occupy a noticeably more settled chapter of his life. He's spoken candidly about his health struggles, including a prostate cancer diagnosis and an early bout with thyroid cancer, and has continued performing well into his 70s and 80s, including a notable appearance at the concert for Ukraine. Away from music, he's known for an enormous and detailed model train collection that occupies space in his home, as well as a lifelong devotion to Celtic Football Club. His marriage to Penny Lancaster, now approaching 2 decades, stands as the longest and by most accounts the most stable relationship of his life, suggesting that whatever lessons came out of the earlier decades eventually did sink in, even if his public reflections on those years still tend to focus more on what he lost than on what the women in his life actually experienced. The story of Rod Stewart's love life isn't really a story about one woman who got away. It's a story about a man whose enormous talent and fame created a gravitational pull strong enough to draw partner after partner into his orbit, sometimes at significant cost to who they were before they met him. Rachel Hunter remains the name he brings up, the relationship he describes as having torn him apart, the one loss he still seems unable to fully resolve. But understanding why she left requires looking past his own account of feeling abandoned, and instead listening to what she herself said about disappearing inside a life that was never really designed to include her as anything other than a supporting presence. That, more than any headline or lawsuit or scandal, is the quieter and more honest version of the story behind the one woman Rod Stewart says he should never have let go.